Now for our second treat. Neovi Karakatsanis. Did I just ruin that one too?
No, you did not.
All right, I'm batting 500, so maybe I'll try for the Giants. Okay, a view of the colonels from the U.S. Congress, supporters and opponents of the Greek regime. Let's learn a little bit about you. You're a professor of political science at Indiana University, South Bend. And I'll confess, Indiana University is sort of the home school, so I was very excited to see that here. President of the Modern Greek Studies Association. Your research focuses on Greek society and politics, including democratic consolidation, U.S. foreign policy toward Greece, something that we were chatting about, the social welfare state, and immigration, which is so timely.
Yes.
Yes. Your work has appeared in South European Society and Politics, Armed Forces and Society, the Journal of Balkan and Near Eastern Studies, Democratization, and Mediterranean Quarterly. You are the author of Politics of Elite Transformation, which sounds very intriguing. So thank you, Neovi.
Sure, thank you. Let me begin by thanking both Andre and Katerina for this invitation to present here. Thank you. I'm honored to be here among such experts in the field. For me, this is a relatively new area. As a political scientist, I have done much of my research on the democratic transition and consolidation process in Greece, and have become interested in the years of the colonel's regime as a result of that research. And so thank you for this opportunity to present with you. As you can see from my first slide, I believe Katerina and I are the conference organizers and I must be competing for the best pulaki. Because, okay. I think what I will do is begin with a quote. Maybe I should move out of the way just a bit more so people can see the quotes. If some ragtag group, including some communists, had taken over Athens in the darkness of night, surely Secretary of State Dean Rusk and the Department of Defense would have sent in some of our planes and airborne troops to protect American lives. And yet, what difference is there in the way the tyrants, whether fascists or communists, rule? The fascist clique now ruling Greece has suppressed personal freedom, established control over press and radio, abrogated the Constitution, and canceled free elections. To date, we have accepted these actions. If instead of right-wing generals, a ragtag group of left-wing extremists and communists had staged a coup d'etat and established a communist government or quasi-communist government in Greece, without a doubt, officials of our State Department and our Defense Department would have immediately taken measures to oust them. The fascists deserve no less. To continue to recognize this criminal regime would be a blight on our honor. These were the words of a U.S. senator, a staunch critic of the colonel's regime in December 1967, following the failed counter-coup launched by then-King Constantine of Greece. Joined by other senators and urging the U.S. government to support the king's counter-coup and to condemn the Greek junta, this senator's proclamation that to continue to recognize the colonel's regime would be a blight on America's honor is but one example of the many condemnations of U.S. government policy in the American Congress during the 7 years of military rule. In fact, during the entire period of the junta, a key problem faced by two consecutive U.S. administrations, that of Lyndon Johnson and of Richard Nixon, was the public outcry against the 1967 coup and the succeeding authoritarian government. Both administrations were faced with the ongoing challenge of how to maintain a supportive attitude toward Greece for Cold War strategic reasons in the face of often strident criticism coming from members of Congress, as well as from American academics, human rights organizations, and many of America's European allies, all of whom frequently lamented the rape of Greek democracy. For various reasons, not least the symbolic incongruity of dictatorship in the birthplace of democracy, opposition to U.S. policy in Greece became a cause célèbre for many during this period, as they tried to pressure the U.S. government to cut its ties with the Greek regime. At the same time, the U.S. sought to strengthen its strategic and military ties. Of all branches of the U.S. government, the one most critical of the colonel's regime was the Congress. Through a close reading and analysis of the congressional debates that dealt with the Greek military government during its 7 years in power, this paper presents the arguments made in the U.S. Congress by both those who supported and those who opposed U.S. policies towards Greece. It shows that while much opposition to the colonel's regime existed in both houses of Congress, at the end of the day, congressional supporters of administration policies, which focused on U.S. strategic interests rather than on arguments of morality and values, prevailed. In other words, Cold War strategic pragmatism trumped an ideological commitment to democracy. This analysis also illustrates the importance of outside groups on the policy-making process. In this regard, I briefly illustrate how two members of Congress in particular seemed especially in tune with local Greek American constituencies, journalists, business people, and interest group leaders who helped shape and reinforce the images that members of Congress held of the colonels. I begin with the arguments made by the opponents of the colonel's regime, those liberals in Congress, or as Jim told me, those damn liberals in Congress, as the Nixon administration in particular referred to them. Those liberals in Congress who regularly critiqued administration policy before turning to those more supportive of strong U.S. ties with the Greek regime. Throughout the entire rule of the colonels, much criticism was directed by Congress both against the military dictatorship itself, as well as against the U.S. government's cordial and even friendly relations with that regime. Members of Congress pointed to the repressive nature of military rule, the regime's imprisonment of the political opposition, and the inhumane treatment of political prisoners, among other denunciations, criticizing both administrations' diplomatic and military ties with the colonels. For instance, in the fall of 1967, a bipartisan group of 52 members of the House of Representatives signed a letter calling for a cutoff of all U.S. assistance to Greece. This was paralleled by objections in the Senate. In the words of Senator Wayne Moores, Democrat of Oregon, and I quote, "Let no one in this country or in Greece be fooled about the why we send this aid to Greece. It has nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with freedom of the Greek people, nothing to do with advancing the cause of personal freedom through constitutional limitations on government action. We do not stand for those things anymore in Greece, just as we do not stand for them in many parts of the world. And in Greece, we stand only for the furnishing of several hundreds of thousands of Greek bodies for the NATO army. That is the total interest of the United States in Greece. For to obtain those soldiers, we have sold out constitutionalism. We have sold out personal liberty, and we have bought any Greek army officer who can deliver soldiers to NATO," unquote. Members of Congress who opposed U.S. government policy towards Greece argued that by continuing to work with the junta rather than overtly oppose it, America's image as a defender of freedom was being badly tarnished. To make the point, members of both houses gave numerous examples from the media or conveyed to them by the Greek opposition that the perception of U.S. support for the colonels was widely held by many Greeks. Such perceptions, they argued, would ultimately prove detrimental to America's future interests in Greece and would result in, quote, "a diminution of U.S. influence," unquote. Addressing fellow senators debating the issue of aid to Greece, Moores argued, "Does its manpower and geography make it worthwhile to keep Greece on the payroll when her government is an illegitimate collection of militarists who prosper from the communist boogaboo and use it as a pretext for strangling liberty in their own country? I say that to keep such a government afloat with U.S. arms and aid of any kind does more harm than good to American interests," unquote. Or as Congressman Don Edwards, Democrat of California, put it, and I quote, "A democratic Greece will make for a healthier NATO ally than a Greece under a dictator's hell," unquote. These opponents of normal U.S.-Greek relations focused their arguments on the symbolic importance of opposing the colonels, highlighting moral justifications as a key part of their appeals. Regularly, they argued that their proposals, often these were amendments to bills intended to cut military support, for example, would serve as a signal to Greeks and to the rest of the world that the United States stood behind liberal democracy. During a debate on the loans of naval vessels to a number of countries, including Greece, Minnesota Congressman Donald Frazier made this point succinctly. According to Frazier, refusing to loan the vessels to Greece would be an important symbolic gesture, and I quote, "We ought to make clear to the rest of the world that the United States believes in what it says it believes in. We ought to demonstrate that we believe certain things are wrong and that we believe in freedom," unquote. Likely aware that the moral arguments would have little sway with those who were most concerned with the importance of Greece to U.S. strategic interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, however, members of Congress repeatedly pointed out that such measures, if passed, that is, for example, the cutting of military aid, that if such measures were passed, they would actually have little real effect on Greece's capabilities within the NATO alliance. Thus, in 1969, when Senator Claiborne Pell offered an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act that would have limited military assistance to Greece, he argued that if approved, it would have at most a, quote, "very small," unquote, impact on military preparedness, since it only prohibited additional grants of military aid beyond those which had already been promised to Greece and were already in the pipeline. The significance of his measure lay in its symbolism. Pell maintained that its aim was to put the Senate on record as opposing the dictatorship, and I quote, "What the amendment does is to clearly demonstrate to the Greek people that even if the executive branch will not say that they object to the presence of the present totalitarian government in Greece and object to the use of torture as a means of political intimidation, at least Congress takes that position," unquote. A similar argument was made some months later during the Senate debate on the Hark Amendment, which if passed would have prohibited funds for military weapons or services to Greece. Its supporters argued that even if funds for military weapons and services were cut, it would have a negligible strategic effect. Instead, the moral and political signal it would send was paramount. And I quote, "To pass the amendment would be to serve public notice that the United States will not condone the development of dictatorship in Europe. It would reaffirm our allegiance to the principles of democracy and freedom at a time when that reaffirmation would mean so much to Greek citizens now struggling under this oppressive regime," unquote. Finally, during the 1970 Senate debate regarding the loan of a submarine to Greece, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii proposed an amendment that would have symbolically denied the loan to the colonels, only symbolically because the submarine was already engaged by the Greek Navy in anti-submarine warfare services. Inouye argued, "I do not expect my amendment to have any massive political, diplomatic, or military repercussions. But what I hope to accomplish today through this symbolic gesture, I repeat, the symbolic gesture, is a reaffirmation of the American commitment to democratic ideals. My amendment offers an opportunity to all members of the Senate to express their opposition to dictatorship without undermining in any way our own security in the Eastern Mediterranean," unquote. In short, arguing that America's association with the junta was a blight on U.S. honor and harmful to the country's long-term strategic interests. The critics of American policy made the argument that opposition to the regime was demanded by the values of liberal democracy. However, to head off any concern that the U.S. was weakening a key Cold War ally in the Mediterranean, these opponents argued that the cutting of military aid would have no real consequence on the regime's capabilities within NATO and therefore would not harm U.S. strategic interests. However, despite the strong congressional opposition to U.S. government policy, it is well known, I'm sure, to all of us here that the supporters of the status quo prevailed. Unlike those who justified the cutting of ties by pointing to the repressive, undemocratic nature of the regime's supporters underscored U.S. strategic interests, making a pragmatic argument for continued good relations. To illustrate, I draw again on the statements made during congressional debates. In doing so, I focus on the arguments made by two particularly outspoken supporters of U.S. government policy towards the Colonel regime, Illinois Congressman Roman Kuczynski and Ed Derwinski, a Democrat and Republican, respectively. It is interesting, though perhaps not very surprising, that supporters of the U.S. government policies towards the junta regularly cited the Greek-American press and a number of Greek-American and Greek-Canadian cultural organizations, pointing to them as backers of the colonels and of the U.S. government's policies towards Greece. Indeed, Kuczynski, a Democratic congressman from the northwest side of Chicago, was an outspoken supporter of the junta who often quoted Greek-American sources to support his position. For example, Kuczynski revealed in September 1967 that he had been invited by the president of the Pan-Arcadian Federation, a man by the name of Chris Mitchell, to be the Federation's guest at its convention in Athens during the preceding summer. While in Athens, Kuczynski reportedly met with Papadopoulos and other leaders of the military government. According to his own account, those meetings convinced Kuczynski that the Soviet Union was increasingly threatening the Mediterranean and had a, quote, grand design, unquote, to take over the Middle East and Africa. Kuczynski was not, of course, the only public official to be invited to Greece as a private citizen to be briefed by junta leaders. Republican Congressman Ed Derwinski, representing a South suburban Chicago district, also accepted an invitation to visit the country, and while there met with members of the colonel's regime, the U.S. ambassador to Athens, members of the press, former parliamentarians, and private Greek citizens. His invitation came from Andrew Faseas, Supreme President of the Order of Ahepa, a leader of the Greek-American community in Chicago, publisher of the conservative Greek-American newspaper Greek Star, and an archon of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. As evidence of his closeness to the Greek regime, in 1969, Faseas would be awarded the Cross of the Commander of the Royal Order of the Phoenix by the junta. Perhaps because of his association with Faseas, Derwinski would fairly regularly insert into the congressional record editorials and other articles appearing in the Greek-American press, particularly from Faseas's Greek Star, often praising the junta. In July 1967, for example, just 3 months after the launching of the Greek dictatorship, Derwinski inserted a Greek Star editorial into the congressional record, arguing that Greece was, quote, the most reliable ally that America could ever count on, unquote, and that the two countries had, quote, always been found facing the common enemy, which of course was communism. The editorial also urged the U.S. to resume its shipments of heavy military equipment to Greece, following the Johnson administration's immediate post-coup suspension. Indeed, throughout the 7 years of military rule, Derwinski continued to regularly incorporate into the congressional record anti-communist, pro-junta newspaper articles that extolled the virtues of the colonel's regime. He even went so far as to assert that the Greek Star newspaper, quote, very accurately reflected the sentiments of Greek Americans, unquote. In addition to visits to Greece by Congressman Derwinski and Puzinski, the Pan-Arcadian Society of America also invited another 10 congressmen, along with their wives, to visit Greece for 2 weeks in 1969 to attend that organization's annual convention in Athens. While there, meetings were arranged with Papadopoulos, Patakos, and Makarezos, among others. Upon their return to the United States, the congressmen then shared stories about the happy, contented, and prosperous people of Greece they had met during their trip. These supporters of continued relations with the junta, such as Puzinski and Derwinski, these supporters of continued relations also highlighted the attitudes of certain members of the Greek American community. For example, lawmakers routinely included into the official record or highlighted during congressional debates resolutions that had been passed by Greek cultural organizations supportive of the colonels. Congressman Derwinski, for example, inserted into the record a letter he received from AHEPA's Supreme President, Andrew Faseas, along with a statement unanimously adopted by official AHEPA policy, which stated that, quote, the order of AHEPA urges the United States continue its military and economic aid and assistance to Greece, unquote. Later, following a 1971 vote taken in the House of Representatives to cut military aid to Greece, a formal resolution passed unanimously by the order of AHEPA at its 49th Supreme Convention in Los Angeles was also included into the congressional record. It placed its members on record as deploring the cutting of military aid to Greece, calling on the U.S. Senate to reject that portion of the foreign aid bill, and making an appeal to the Senate that it restore and continue full military aid to the country. Based on the AHEPA statement, a number of senators and congressmen declared that Greek organizations in the United States and Canada were unhappy with Congress's decision to limit military assistance to Greece. They argued that in addition to AHEPA, the Society of the Custodians of New York, Omonia, the Pan-Epirotic Federation of America and Canada, and the Pan-Arcadian Federation unanimously voted to urge the Senate to restore Greece's military aid. In fact, the Pan-Epirotic Federation went so far as to call upon senators to, quote, go on record as favoring Greek aid irrespective of internal reforms in Greece, unquote. In short, those who supported friendly relations between the United States and the colonel's regime appear to have been influenced by the positions of various Greek American organizations, influential Greek American elites with positions of prominence in the Greek American community, as well as conservative segments of the Greek American press. Unlike the congressional opposition to the colonel's regime, which largely made arguments based on moral justifications and democratic principles, supporters of the government's policies argued that the United States should continue on its course of diplomacy with the colonels, based in large part on America's strategic interests, on non-intervention into the affairs of other states, as well as on a belief that the colonels were fighting communism and would eventually democratize. Ultimately, it would be the arguments of such supporters that would prevail in Congress. As just mentioned, supporters of the U.S. government's policies towards Greece maintained that America's strategic interests required continued good relations with the colonels. According to this view, continued interaction between the two countries was essential since the colonels were strong supporters of the U.S. and NATO. Given the worsening crisis in the Middle East at this time, as well as increased Soviet influence in the Mediterranean region, Many members of Congress maintained that having a trustworthy and loyal ally in this part of the world was of utmost necessity. They insisted that the colonels were proving themselves such an ally. As Derwinski argued, quote, "The Soviet foothold in Egypt, Syria, and other Arab nations magnifies the strategic location of Greece as our ally," unquote. Thus, when the United States decided to temporarily suspend military assistance in 1967 as a result of the colonel's coup, Brzezinski forcefully argued that it was in America's interest to renew military aid as part of the NATO defense structure. As he put it, "Let no one kid you. There are powerful communist forces at play in this area, and NATO needs all the help it can get. I submit, Mr. Speaker, America needs Greece today a great deal more than Greece needs us," unquote. This, the strategic importance of Greece, was highlighted during Senate debates as well. Pointing to the inroads that Russia was making in Egypt and Algeria, Democratic Senator Richard Russell of Georgia argued that, quote, "This was not the time to be kicking in the teeth of the military dictatorship by withdrawing ships from Greece," unquote. The approach was perhaps best exemplified by Congressman John Schmitz, Republican of California, when he quipped on March 28, 1972, that the U.S. military assistance is not given as a reward for someone's idea of democratic excellence in government, but for the attainment of our own strategic purposes, unquote. Related to the pragmatic, strategic arguments most often made in support of the Johnson and Nixon administration's policies were the claims that the colonels were proving themselves a loyal, dependable ally to the United States and thus deserved continued support. Numerous examples of such loyalty were given. In 1967, both Derwinski and Brzezinski pointed out that the colonels had been willing to enter into discussion with the Turks over the Cyprus dispute and had accepted the U.S. suggestion to withdraw Greek troops from the island, thereby resolving the immediate dispute with Turkey and avoiding war. Closely related to the notion that the colonels were friendly allies of the United States was the contention that while undemocratic, they were strongly anti-communist, something of paramount importance during this period of the Cold War. Moreover, many argued that in their estimation, the colonels had every intention of returning Greece to democracy, as they themselves repeatedly claimed. According to Brzezinski, and I quote, "The free nations of the world ought to recognize the efforts of Prime Minister Papadopoulos and Deputy Prime Minister Patakos to restore democratic rule and help this nation on this course rather than sit back on the sidelines and undermine her efforts," unquote. Brzezinski and others thus considered it important for the United States to help the Papadopoulos regime in its efforts to restore democracy, while maintaining that it would be entirely inappropriate for the United States to take any action in opposition to the colonels, arguing that to oppose them would represent an inappropriate interference in Greek affairs. This position, held by many in Congress, was that the U.S. should not interfere in the internal affairs of Greece, as doing so would amount to imposing our form of government on that country. I draw again from the 1967 congressional debate regarding the authorization of loans of naval vessels to a number of countries, including Greece, to illustrate a particularly pertinent example of this position. In that debate, Democratic Congressman Jim Bates of California, addressing those opposed to the the authorization of the loan, maintained that Greece had not only been a good post-war ally and therefore should receive a loan of 1 submarine and 2 destroyers, but that also, and I quote, "It is not right to try to fashion every country in the world in our image here in the United States," unquote. Democratic Congressman Mendel Rivers agreed, emphasizing that he too did not believe we can impose Pax Americana on every people and nation on earth. Somewhere down the line, we are going to have to let somebody else run his own country instead of us dipping our nose into it, unquote. And in the words of Republican Congressman from Florida, "I had hoped that if the past few years had taught us anything about the conduct of our foreign policy, it was that the days of our playing policemen for the world should be over, that the days when we made it our business to meddle in other countries' affairs are best left in the past, that our mission as a nation to make the world safe for democracy was as dated as Versailles and the League of Nations." Yet, irony of ironies, what do we see before us today? A group of self-appointed consciences of the nation trying to dictate through economic pressure the internal political course the Greeks should follow. I think it is time that we stop using our foreign policy and our foreign aid as leverage to force other countries to take orders from us, unquote. And here I'm skipping a lot to get to the conclusion. So, despite arguments that highlighted the irony of this particular view, few congressmen were swayed. The arguments in support of non-interfering, that is to offer support to the colonels, prevailed. So in conclusion, while a growing literature is emerging on many aspects of the United States policies towards the Greek dictatorship, relatively little has been written about the most critically outspoken institution in the U.S. government, the Congress. This paper has begun to fill that void, or it hopes to have begun to fill that void, by analyzing the arguments set forth by both congressional supporters and opponents of continued relations with the regime. I have attempted to illustrate that while many members of Congress argued for a breaking of ties and a public condemnation of the colonel's regime, those who supported continued relations with the junta prevailed. Thus, arguments focused on the importance of non-intervention and on a short-term understanding of U.S. strategic interests in the context of the Cold War prevailed over the moral arguments regarding the value of liberal democracy. In short, then, this paper highlights the priority of pragmatism over democratic principle in shaping U.S. foreign policy during this time. However, the study also points to the need for future research on the role played by various actors within the Greek American community, particularly cultural associations, the Greek American press, and prominent leaders of the Greek American community. As we have seen, such actors appear to have played a role in helping to shape the images and perceptions members of Congress had of the colonels, influencing their opposition, as well as the possible alternatives to the dictatorship. Given the important role these actors played in shaping the perceptions and policy positions of elected officials, future research on U.S. relations with the junta may want to explore the linkages between elected officials and their constituents, particularly in close elections with a fairly sizable Greek American voter base.